The year is 1911. A slow-moving freight train screeches to a halt at a dark railway junction in the middle of the American heartland. A man steps down from a wooden boxcar, blending seamlessly into the midnight fog. He doesn't have a horse, he doesn't have a car, and he isn't carrying a weapon. He doesn't need to. He walks down the gravel tracks, enters a quiet, sleepy neighborhood, and looks for a house with an unlocked back door. Within an hour, an entire family is systematically bludgeoned to death in their beds. By sunrise, the killer is already miles away, sleeping peacefully in a different freight car heading west. And when the local sheriff arrives at the bloody crime scene a few hours later, he will immediately blame a local business rival, a traveling preacher, or a disgruntled neighbor. He has absolutely no idea that his town was just a single stop on a blood-soaked railway line cutting directly through the center of America. Long before the FBI coined the term serial killer, a faceless entity treated the transcontinental railroad like a personal, open-world hunting ground. Between 1898 and 1912, dozens of near-identical family axe murders occurred across Illinois, Colorado, Kansas, and Iowa, all within a few blocks of the tracks. The police called them isolated tragedies. The newspapers called them random acts of madness. But when you map the data, you don't see random acts. You see a network. You see a terrifying, calculated macro pattern. Tonight, we pull back from the small-town gossip of Villisca, Iowa, and look at the larger machinery of death. We're diving deep down the rabbit hole into the terrifying criminal profiling, the chilling behavioral signatures, and the institutional failures that allowed America's most prolific, forgotten phantom to ride the rails completely undetected. While England was in the midst of trying to figure out Jack the Ripper, America had a monster far worse on the loose, and no one even knew he existed. Welcome back to Chilled Bones. If you watched our deep dive into the Villisca Axe murders, you already know how that single case completely broke a small town in Iowa. But focusing entirely on Villisca is like looking at a single drop of blood and missing the entire crime scene. We have to look at the baseline facts from a broader, macro-level perspective. In the early years of the 20th century, the American heartland was experiencing an unprecedented boom, entirely driven by the transcontinental railroad. Tracks were cutting through fields, creating instant towns, and bringing wealth, progress, and travelers right to the doorsteps of ordinary people. But the tracks didn't just bring progress. They brought a subterranean nightmare. Between 1898 and 1912, a staggering sequence of mass slaughters quietly played out across the Midwest. Colorado Springs, Colorado, in Monmouth, Illinois, in Ellsworth, Kansas, in Blue Island, Illinois. In every single instance, the narrative was exactly the same. An entire family, mother, father, and multiple children, wiped out in their beds with an axe that belonged to the property. If this happened today, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit would have a multi-state task force assembled within 48 hours. The signatures are too loud, too specific, and too deeply pathological to ignore. But in 1911, the concept of multi-state serial killer didn't exist. Local sheriffs didn't have phones that connected jurisdictions to 3 states over. They didn't share fingerprint files or behavioral profiles. They didn't even know what a behavioral profile was. They barely talked to the next town over. Because of that institutional blindness, Local authorities consistently botched their investigations. They locked up innocent neighbors, ruined the reputations of local businessmen, and hyper-focused on petty small-town drama while the real monster was already checking the schedules for the next outbound freight train. Tonight, we aren't chasing the local gossip. We're analyzing the mechanics of a historical ghost. We're going to break down the exact timeline of the Matrix, look at the chilling psychological anomalies the killer left behind at every single stop, and introduce you to the prime suspect, a German transient named Paul Mueller, whose footprint matches the blood on the tracks perfectly. Before we continue on to part 1 of this massive investigation, I'd like you to please hit the like and subscribe buttons below. Your support keeps this channel alive, and I deeply appreciate every single view and subscription I get. Also, if you're interested in the creepy and macabre, which I know you are, please check out my horror novels. I've written several of them, and they're all specifically engineered to cause sleepless nights with the lights on and the covers pulled over your heads. You can find out more about them at chilledbones.com. Part 1. Mapping the Rails. To grasp the true scale of the Midwest Axeman Matrix, we have to treat the American Heartland not as a collection of separate states, but as a massive grid connected by iron and steel. The killer didn't look at maps. He didn't look at train schedules. And when you align the dates of these slaughters with the path of the transcontinental freight lines, the random chaos of true crime transforms into a terrifyingly logical itinerary. Let's go back to September of 1911, a month where the Matrix accelerated at a speed that should have triggered a national emergency. Our first stop is Colorado Springs, Colorado. On the night of September 17th, a man named H.C. Wayne, his wife, and their corporate house guest, Mrs. A.J. Burnham, were asleep in a home situated just blocks from the local rail yard. Sometime in the dead of night, an intruder stepped into the house. He didn't bring a weapon. He found an axe on the property, walked from room to room, and bludgeoned all 3 occupants using the blunt side of the tool. When neighbors discovered the bodies the next day, they found a detail that would soon become a chilling trademark. The windows had been carefully covered with cloth, and the faces of the victims were hidden beneath their bed covers. The mirrors were also covered. Exactly 4 days later, on September 21st, the entity struck again, this time 600 miles away in Ellsworth, Kansas. A mother and her 2 young children were executed in their beds. The house sat within walking distance of the Union Pacific line. The weapon, the family's own axe, left at the scene. The signatures? Windows were draped, bodies were covered, mirrors were covered. For a normal traveler in 1911, making the trip from Colorado Springs to Ellsworth in under 4 days while evading detection would be a logistical challenge. For a transient hopping eastbound freight trains, it was simply a matter of riding the rails. But the Matrix wasn't done with September. Just 9 days after the Kansas murders, on September 30th, the Shadow stepped off a train in Monmouth, Illinois, directly along the main line of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. He walked to the home of the Dawson family. William Dawson, his wife, and their young daughter were bludgeoned to death in their sleep with the flat end of an axe. Once again, the killer spent time inside their home after the slaughter, pulling the bedsheets over their destroyed features, obscuring the glass panes of the windows and the mirrors. 3 identical mass murders, 3 different states, all within a span of just 13 days. If you look at a map of the United States, these towns seem entirely unrelated. But if you look at a map of the American railroad networks of 1911, Colorado Springs, Ellsworth, and Monmouth are practically next-door neighbors. They were major coal, water, or freight junctions where trains were forced to sit on side tracks in the dark for hours waiting for their clearances. While the local sheriffs in Colorado were busy interrogating local vagrants, the killer was already in Kansas picking out his next target. While the Kansas police were looking for disgruntled farmhands, the monster was stepping off a boxcar in Illinois. The killer was utilizing the fastest, most expansive transit system in the world to outrun the speed of early 20th century communication. He was a phantom riding a machine, leaving a trail of blood across the Heartland while institutional gears of law enforcement remained entirely frozen in place. Part 2. The Behavioral Fingerprint. When modern criminal profilers look at a series of unsolved crimes, they don't just look at where the bodies were found. They look for behavior that wasn't strictly necessary to commit the crime. A killer has to find a victim and execute them. That's the mechanics. But everything else they do inside that space, the weird, non-functional rituals, is their psychological fingerprint. And across the entire Midwest matrix, the killer's fingerprint was practically glowing in the dark. Let's look at the first psychological signature, the choice of weapon. The killer almost never carried an axe with him on the train. Clinically speaking, traveling on a crowded freight car while carrying a blood-soaked, heavy logging tool is a terrible tactical decision. It draws attention. Instead, the killer relied entirely on the complacency of early 20th century households. He would slip onto a property in the dead of night, walk over to the backyard woodpile or coal shed, and retrieve a tool every family had, an axe. Think about the psychological confidence required to do this. He is entering a completely unknown property, unarmed, counting on the fact that a weapon will be waiting for him outside. Then he takes that weapon into a pitch-black house full of sleeping strangers. It tells us we're dealing with an entity operating with a staggering level of environmental control. He wasn't panicked. He was entirely at home in the dark, completely comfortable in his element. The second signature is the execution method itself. Just like in Villisca, the killer across the wider matrix consistently chose to use the flat, blunt back end of the axe head to initiate his attacks. True crime writers love to talk about the rage of a killer cutting down a family, but using the blunt side is a choice of clinical efficiency, not chaotic rage. A heavy blow from the blunt, flat side of an axe to the head causes massive immediate skull fractures, knocking the sleeping victim unconscious or killing them instantly without a sound. It ensures the house remained totally silent as he moved from bed to bed. But it's what happened after the slaughters that reveals the true pathology of the Axeman. In Colorado Springs, in Ellsworth, in Monmouth, and later in Villisca, the killer routinely stayed inside the homes for hours with the bodies. He didn't grab the silverware and sprint back to the train tracks. He stayed in the quiet, cooling atmosphere of his own monstrosity. He would systematically move from room to room, taking sheets, towels, or articles of clothing from the dressers to drape over every single window and mirror in the house. If you talk to a paranormal researcher, they'll tell you this is a spiritual barrier, binding the dead so they can't seek vengeance. But clinically, this is a severe manifestation of a defense mechanism called depersonalization. When a transient psychopath encounters the reality of an entire family, including children, that he has just annihilated, his own mind is a wall. By covering the mirrors, he ensures he doesn't have to look at his own reflection and face the reality of what he is. By covering the windows, he shuts out the rest of the world, creating an isolated pocket reality where his crimes don't actually exist to the public yet. And finally, he covered their faces. Every single victim across the Matrix was found with their bedclothes pulled entirely over their ruined features. In criminal profiling, this is the universal hallmark of post-offense guilt. The killer couldn't handle the empty, unblinking stare of the lives he had just stolen. By hiding their faces, he transformed human beings back into inanimate shapes, allowing him to calmly wash his hands in their kitchens, linger in their parlors, and carefully lock their doors from the outside before vanishing back into the fog. The local police departments looked at these covered windows and hidden faces and assumed it was just the eccentric behavior of a local madman. They failed to realize that they weren't looking at a chaotic lunatic. They were looking at a highly organized, deeply methodical traveler who was leaving a psychological signature across 4 different states. Part 3. The Ghost on the Line. When you look at the sheer geographic footprint of the Midwest Axeman matrix, it seems impossible that a single individual could commit these atrocities across multiple states without ever being caught or identified by name. But as the years rolled on and independent researchers began to piece together the scattered fragments of early 20th century crime reports, a singular, terrifying identity stepped out from the shadows of the railway line. His name was Paul Mueller. Clinically speaking, Mueller was the exact definition of a transient phantom. Born in Germany, he immigrated to the United States and spent his life floating across the country, working as a farmhand, an itinerant laborer, and a wood chopper. He was a man who survived entirely on the fringes of society, possessing no permanent address, no family ties, and an unsettling expert proficiency with an axe. Mueller first explicitly entered the historical criminal record in 1898 in West Brookfield, Massachusetts. He had been employed as a farmhand by a man named John Newton. After a dispute regarding his employment, Mueller waited until the dead of night, retrieved an axe, and brutally slaughtered Newton and his wife in their beds. When local authorities discovered the bodies the next morning, they were confronted with a scene that would, a decade later, become the blueprint for the Heartland killings. Mueller didn't just strike them, he annihilated them. He used a heavy, blunt instrument for the killing, then pulled the bedding entirely over their faces post-mortem. He spent time inside the house after the execution, systematically obscuring the windows with cloth to prevent anyone from looking in, before walking down to the nearby Boston and Albany railroad tracks and vanishing onto a westbound freight train. Mueller was never apprehended for the Massachusetts murders. He simply devolved into the expanding network of the American rail system. But criminal historians who have painstakingly mapped Mueller's suspected migratory patterns have found a chilling, almost perfect synchronization between his known locations and the timeline of the Matrix. Wherever a transient matching Mueller's physical description was reported working short-term agricultural gigs, a family axe slaughter would occur along the rail line just days or weeks later. He was the perfect invisible monster. In 1911, if a man showed up in a small town looking for a week of hard labor in the fields, nobody asked for identification. Nobody ran a background check. There weren't even background checks. You gave him a bunk in the barn, paid him in cash, and didn't think twice when he was gone by Monday morning. If that same man used his night off to slip into a nearby home, execute an entire family, and hop a midnight boxcar to the next state, the local sheriff would spend years blaming a local businessman rival because they literally had no concept of a transient serial killer. Paul Mueller understood the fundamental flaw of early American law enforcement. It was strictly regional. By the time an Iowa sheriff realized a crime had been committed, Mueller was already 300 miles away in Illinois, introducing himself to a new farmer under a completely different name. He turned the Transcontinental Railroad into a mechanical shield, using the very tracks that built the American dream to carry out an absolute nightmare. Conclusion: the tracks run cold. So, what ultimately happened to Paul Mueller? Where does the track end for the man who likely orchestrated the most prolific cross-country slaughter in early American history and made Jack the Ripper look like an amateur? The grim clinical reality is, we'll probably never know. After the Villisca slaughter in 1912, the Midwest Axeman matrix abruptly went cold. The signature of family executions along the railway lines simply stopped. If you look at the historical record, there's no dramatic arrest, no sensational courtroom confession, and no execution. Paul Mueller simply did what he had always done. He dissolved back into the landscape. In an era before computerized databases, social security numbers, and national state-to-state tracking, a man could change his name, grow a beard, cross a state line, and completely erase his past. Criminal profilers have two main theories for why a serial killer of this magnitude suddenly stops. The first is institutional or physical intervention, meaning Mueller either died or was locked away for an unrelated crime. As a transient riding the freight lines, his life was inherently hazardous. He could have slipped between the cars of a moving train, died of an illness in a nameless hobo camp, or been killed in a quiet knife fight in a rail yard. His body buried in a pauper's grave under a completely fabricated alias. The second, more chilling theory is that he simply aged out of his pathology. Mass slaughters with a heavy logging axe require an immense amount of physical stamina, agility, and strength. By the mid-1910s, Mueller would have been an older man. It is entirely possible he settled down in a remote corner of the country, living out his remaining days as a quiet, eccentric farmhand, sitting on a porch somewhere in the American Heartland, while the local newspapers right down the street were still printing wild conspiracy theories about Frank Jones and the local tractor wars in Villisca, Iowa. Today, the tracks that fueled the Midwest Axeman matrix still cut through the same small towns. The trains still roll past the old wooden homes in the dead of night, their horns echoing across the plains. But the true horror of this case isn't a supernatural entity haunting the rails. It's the realization that a flesh and blood man discovered a structural glitch in the American legal system and used it to treat the Heartland like a personal slaughterhouse. He proved that if you move fast enough, stay quiet enough, and leave your identity out on the tracks, you can walk away a ghost, and no one will ever know you were right in their backyard. If this story interests you and you'd like to see more content like this, please hit the like and subscribe buttons below. Your support means so much to me, and I deeply appreciate every single view and subscription I get. Also, if you're interested in the creepy and macabre, which I imagine you are, please check out my novels. I've written several of them, all guaranteed to cause sleepless nights with the lights on and the covers pulled over your heads. You can find out more about them at chilledbones.com. I'm Robert Ferentz. This has been Chilled Bones. Until next time, keep your lights on, double check your locks, and stay tuned to Chilled Bones, because out here in the dark, the shadows might just follow you home.